Imagine the blinding, suffocating heat of the unforgiving Mexican desert in the spring of 1916. The world is standing on the absolute, terrifying edge of a massive historical cliff. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the mechanized, industrialized slaughter of the First World War is already chewing up millions of young men in the muddy trenches of Europe. But here, in the sprawling, desolate plains of Chihuahua, the United States Army is still clinging desperately to the romanticized ghosts of the 19th century. They are a military force built entirely on the fragile backs of horses, fighting a dusty, frustrating war against a phantom enemy who knows the harsh terrain better than they do. The era of the cavalry charge, the drawn saber, and the honorable horseback duel is taking its final dying breaths in the choking alkaline dust. And waiting impatiently in the wings of this chaotic transition is a restless, wealthy, incredibly arrogant 30-year-old cavalry lieutenant who is absolutely desperate to taste human blood. He does not want to wait for the war to come to him. He wants to chase it down. And he is about to do something so incredibly unorthodox, so incredibly reckless, and so brutally effective that it will fundamentally alter the DNA of American warfare forever. Today, we are going to look at the exact moment the legendary General George S. Patton permanently traded his horse for a combustion engine, strapping a custom-engraved revolver to his hip and driving a civilian automobile directly into a bloody point-blank firefight. We are going to uncover the untold story of America's very first motorized combat mission, and how the terrifying legend of old blood and guts was actually born in a cloud of gasoline fumes and gunsmoke decades before he ever saw a German tank. Before we dive into the gritty, brutal details of this wild, unprecedented desert shootout, I need you to do something. If you are sick and tired of the sanitized, boring, polite versions of history they forced you to read in high school, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now. We only deal in the raw, unfiltered truth of human conflict. Also, I want to test your instinct right out of the gate. If you were a cavalry officer trained your entire life to fight on horseback, and someone handed you the keys to a clunky, unreliable early automobile to go hunt down heavily armed bandits, would you take the keys or stick to the saddle? Type the word engine in the comments if you would embrace the future, or type the word saddle if you would trust the horse. We read every single comment, and your engagement is the only reason we can keep ripping the polite covers off these incredible historical moments. Let us set the geopolitical board. To truly understand the absolute madness of what happened at the San Miguelito Ranch, you have to understand the deeply frustrating, boiling pot atmosphere of the Punitive Expedition. The notorious Mexican revolutionary Pancho had recently crossed the border and violently raided the small American town of Columbus, New Mexico, leaving a trail of dead American civilians and burning buildings in his wake. In response, a furious American government dispatched General John J. Pershing deep into the hostile, unmapped wilderness of northern Mexico, with strict orders to hunt Villa down and bring him to justice, dead or alive. But the expedition was a logistical nightmare from the very first day. The American horses, bred for polite parades and mild weather, were collapsing and dying by the hundreds in the brutal, unrelenting desert heat. The supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the elusive Mexican rebels were running circles around the heavy, slow-moving American cavalry columns. Trapped right in the middle of this frustrating, miserable, dust-choked campaign was young Lieutenant George S. Patton, Jr. Patton was currently serving as General Pershing's personal aide, a prestigious but highly bureaucratic position that Patton utterly, violently despised. Patton genuinely believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was the reincarnated soul of ancient warriors. He believed he was born specifically to kill the enemies of his nation in glorious, face-to-face combat. Sitting at a folding wooden desk, shuffling paperwork, and managing the general's schedule while a war was happening just over the horizon was driving him absolutely insane. He was constantly begging for combat patrols, constantly looking for an excuse to leave the safety of the command tent, and constantly polishing his personal weapons. He refused to carry the standard-issue military sidearm, believing it lacked the necessary dramatic flair for a true warrior. Instead, he carried a massive, privately purchased Colt single-action army revolver, a Peacemaker, fitted with heavily engraved, beautiful ivory grips. He looked like a character stepping directly out of a Wild West dime novel. But the terrifying reality was that he possessed the lethal, cold-blooded intent to actually use it. The spark that ignited this historical powder keg arrived in the form of a fragile, unverified intelligence tip. Patton received a whispered rumor from a local informant that Julio Cardenas, a highly dangerous captain in Pancho Villa's personal elite guard, was quietly hiding out at a remote walled agricultural compound known as the San Miguelito Ranch. Cardenas was a high-value target, a hardened killer who had been a massive thorn in the side of the American forces. For Patton, this was not just a military objective. This was his moment. This was his destiny, finally knocking on the door. But instead of saddling up a troop of exhausted cavalry horses and beginning a slow, miserable multi-day trek across the blistering desert that would almost certainly give Cardenas enough time to spot the dust cloud and escape, Patton made a decision that would forever change the trajectory of military history. He looked past the stables and walked directly toward a line of Dodge touring cars that had been brought along strictly for ferrying high-ranking officers and delivering mail. These vehicles were completely unarmored, open-topped, and highly prone to breaking down in the harsh desert environment. No one in the United States military had ever seriously considered using them as active, offensive combat assault vehicles. It was considered absurd. But Patton didn't see fragile transportation. He saw pure mechanical speed. He saw the element of total surprise. He quickly requisitioned 3 of the Dodge automobiles, packed them tightly with 10 heavily armed soldiers from the 6th Infantry Regiment, grabbed a civilian guide, and ordered the drivers to push the combustion engines to their absolute limits. The heavy smell of horses and leather was instantly replaced by the sharp, toxic stench of burning oil, gasoline, and hot metal, as the 3 vehicles tore out of the American camp, kicking up a massive, blinding rooster tail of desert dust as they sped toward the ranch. I want you to pause right here and put yourself in the passenger seat of that bouncing, rattling, completely unprotected Dodge touring car. You are bouncing violently over unpaved, deeply rutted desert tracks, clutching a heavy military rifle, rushing headlong toward a fortified compound, filled with seasoned killers who have been surviving in this brutal landscape their entire lives. There is no radio to call for backup. There is no armored plating to stop a sniper's bullet. If the engine dies in the middle of the desert, you are completely stranded in hostile territory. The sheer adrenaline-fueled madness of this approach is staggering. You are essentially bringing a noisy, fragile science experiment into a deadly gunfight. What is going through your mind as you see the adobe walls of the ranch finally appearing through the heat haze on the horizon? Do you feel a surge of absolute terror? Or do you feel the intoxicating thrill of doing something that no soldier in the history of the world has ever done before? Type the word terror in the comments if you would be sweating bullets in that open car. Or type the word thrill if you would be gripping your rifle with a smile on your face. Your reaction tells us exactly how you would handle the terrifying, chaotic bridge between ancient warfare and modern combat. As the 3 mechanical beasts roared up to the outer perimeter of the San Miguelito Ranch, the element of surprise was absolutely total. The Mexican rebels inside the compound were intimately familiar with the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They knew how to listen for the specific rhythm of a cavalry patrol. But the deep, guttural, mechanical roar of 3 automobile engines rapidly converging on their position was something entirely alien and deeply terrifying. Before the dust from the skidding tires had even begun to settle, Patton was already moving. He leaped out of the passenger seat of the lead vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop, his hand immediately dropping to the heavy ivory grip of his Colt revolver. Almost instantly, the heavy wooden gates of the compound violently burst open, and 3 Mexican men on horseback, including Julio Cardenas himself, charged desperately out into the open, realizing they had been completely cornered. They spurred their horses directly toward the American vehicles, raising their rifles and firing wildly into the dust. The crack of incoming rifle fire snapped through the air, bullets impacting the dirt and tearing through the thin metal of the automobiles. This was the exact moment that George S. Patton had been waiting for his entire adult life. He did not dive for cover. He did not retreat behind the engine block of the Dodge. He stood perfectly, terrifyingly still in the open sunlight, completely exposed to the incoming enemy fire. He drew his massive Colt Peacemaker, leveled it with a cold, mechanical precision, and began to return fire. The gunfight that erupted outside those adobe walls was not a polite, organized military engagement. It was a chaotic, point-blank, incredibly violent clash of 2 completely different eras of human history. The popping of the Mexican rifles was rapidly answered by the heavy, deafening boom of Patton's .45 caliber revolver and the disciplined volley fire of the 10 American infantrymen who had deployed from the cars. Patton fired his weapon until the hammer clicked empty, the smell of sulfur burning his nostrils. In a display of terrifying, ice-cold composure that would later become his absolute trademark across the bloody battlefields of Europe, Patton calmly ejected the spent brass casings from his revolver and carefully reloaded the weapon with fresh cartridges, while enemy bullets were literally kicking up the dirt around his boots and striking the walls behind him. The Mexican riders were caught in a brutal, inescapable crossfire. The speed of the automobiles had allowed the American soldiers to completely flank the exits before the bandits could properly react. Within a matter of minutes, the chaotic roar of gunfire suddenly died down, replaced only by the hissing of the overheated car radiators and the heavy breathing of the soldiers. The thick desert dust slowly cleared to reveal the brutal aftermath. The legendary cavalry charge had been utterly broken by men stepping out of cars. All 3 of the Mexican rebels, including the high-value target Julio Cardenas, had been shot dead, their bodies lying motionless in the dirt. Patton had won his very first actual firefight. He had looked the enemy in the eye, stood his ground under fire, and emerged completely untouched. He had proven to himself, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the ancient warrior spirit he believed lived inside his chest was absolutely real. But the chaotic violence of the shootout was only the first half of the legend that was born that day. Having successfully neutralized the target, Patton was immediately faced with a highly practical, gruesome logistical problem. He needed to bring undeniable, physical proof of the kill back to General Pershing at the American headquarters. He could not leave the bodies to be claimed by the desert, and he certainly could not fit 3 bleeding corpses into the small, cramped passenger compartments of the Dodge touring cars, along with his soldiers. So Patton did something that was so incredibly dark, so intensely primal, and so deeply psychological that it permanently cemented his reputation among the men of the expedition. He ordered his soldiers to pick up the bleeding, lifeless bodies of Cardenas and his men, carry them over to the idling automobiles, and tightly strap them directly onto the hot metal hoods of the Dodge cars. They tied the corpses down with heavy ropes, exactly the way a proud hunter would strap a dead stag to the hood of a truck after a successful hunt. It was a brutal, visceral, and highly controversial display of absolute dominance. Patton was not just transporting bodies, he was sending a terrifying psychological message to anyone watching. He climbed back into the passenger seat, right behind the hood ornament of human flesh, and ordered the drivers to head back to base. I want you to vividly imagine the absolutely surreal, horrifying spectacle that slowly rolled into the American military encampment a few hours later. The exhausted, dust-covered regular army soldiers stopped whatever they were doing and simply stared in complete, stunned silence. 3 civilian automobiles, coated in a thick layer of desert grime, roaring through the center of the camp, with the bloody, dust-caked bodies of their enemies strapped to the hoods like gruesome trophies of war. And sitting right behind those bodies, with a cold, satisfied look on his face and a smoking, ivory-handled revolver strapped to his hip, was a 30-year-old lieutenant who had just dragged the United States Army kicking and screaming into the 20th century. When General John J. Pershing emerged from his command tent and witnessed this bizarre, terrifying, and deeply politically incorrect procession, he did not court-martial the young officer. He looked at the bodies, he looked at the cars, and he looked at the wild, intense fire burning in Patton's eyes. Pershing shook his head and famously dubbed Patton his Bandito. It was a nickname born out of a mixture of deep frustration and undeniable, profound respect. Pershing realized, perhaps before anyone else in the American military establishment, that warfare was changing rapidly, and that the men who were going to win the next great global conflict were not going to be polite, rule-following bureaucrats. They were going to be ruthless, highly aggressive innovators who were willing to strap the enemy to the hood of a car to make a point. This incredibly violent, bizarre incident in the Mexican desert was not just a random skirmish in a forgotten border conflict. It was the absolute, undeniable birth of mechanized warfare for the United States military. In those few chaotic minutes outside the San Miguelito ranch, George S. Patton realized a fundamental truth that would eventually allow him to crush the armored might of the German Third Reich. He realized that the horse was dead. He realized that the future of human conflict belonged entirely to the internal combustion engine. He understood that speed, mechanical reliability, and the sheer psychological shock value of bringing heavy firepower to the enemy faster than they could possibly react was the ultimate key to total victory. The man who would eventually command hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of 70-ton steel tanks across the blood-soaked fields of France, Belgium, and Germany learned his most valuable lesson in a fragile, unarmored Dodge civilian car. He learned that technology changes, but the brutal, aggressive, unforgiving nature of the warrior must remain exactly the same. As we close the file on this incredible, untold origin story of America's most controversial and brilliant general, I want to hear your final, honest verdict on the man's highly unorthodox methods. When you look at the raw facts of the San Miguelito raid, the reckless charge into hostile territory in civilian cars, the point-blank gunfight, and the incredibly gruesome, primal decision to strap the bodies of his enemies to the hoods of those cars like hunting trophies, how do you judge the young George S. Patton? Was he a brilliant, forward-thinking visionary who perfectly adapted to the changing nature of warfare and gave his country exactly the kind of ruthless killer it desperately needed for the dark century ahead? Or do you think his actions were those of a reckless, deeply unstable glory hound who cared far more about building his own personal mythology and satisfying his bloodlust than he did about military discipline and honorable conduct? I want you to head directly down to the comment section right now and cast your final vote in this historical debate. Type the word visionary if you firmly believe Patton's motorized shootout was a stroke of absolute tactical genius that proved he was ahead of his time, or type the word reckless if you fiercely believe his cowboy antics and gruesome trophy hunting were a dangerous liability that crossed the line of civilized military behavior. We actively read absolutely every single perspective, and your powerful, honest voice is exactly what drives this fascinating historical debate forward into the future. Thank you for joining us today as we dig deep past the sterilized, boring propaganda and the polite, sanitized history books to find the raw, beating heart of true human conflict. These are the intense, unforgettable stories of psychological warfare, brutal innovation, and the unforgiving, complex reality of the men who shaped the modern world that you simply will not ever find in a standard classroom lecture. If you truly want to keep exploring the intense, unfiltered, and deeply shocking truths of the men and women who lived, fought, and completely broke the mold of history, please make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now so you never miss an episode. Your continued support, your passionate comments, and your daily engagement are the absolute only reasons we can keep bringing these legendary, untold, and highly suppressed moments back to life for a new generation. Stay incredibly curious, stay fiercely objective, and always remember that in the great, chaotic, unpredictable theater of human history, the future usually belongs to the people who are crazy enough to drive straight into the fire. We will see you in the next video. Stay strong.